Hey folks, I'm back with round 6 of the Minnesota GM Norm round robin tournament. In this round, I was paired with International Master Sean Nagle, who I've never played before, but I remember seeing some of his games in the Pro Chess League, so I was aware that he's definitely a strong player. And yeah, coming off of a loss, it wasn't exactly the most comfortable opponent to meet, like playing black, but well, like I mentioned, it just didn't really matter in the long run. I just tried to look at the games as just pure training one by one. Okay, so in this game, he ends up going for d4, knight f6, knight f3, and he chooses the fianchetto system, which I think is definitely one of the lines I looked at. I wasn't quite sure what he was going to play, but I believe he played this a few rounds earlier in the tournament, so I thought there's definitely a decent chance he might repeat it. So castles. Now black has a very wide choice here. Of course, I'm a King's Indian player, so I opted for d6. A lot of Grunfeld players would simply play d5 here. I think c5 is also possible. So yeah, a lot of different ways for black to play the position. I chose d6. Now c4 would lead to kind of the main lines of the fianchetto King's Indian, but my opponent decided to play b3, which is definitely a very trendy line. Actually, I had this. This is the line that Vladimir Kramnik played against me, so I definitely remember vividly preparing and then playing that game. Yeah, so I went for a pretty common setup here with knight bd7. I think this is different from the way I played it against Kramnik. Bishop b2, rook e8, and black's idea here is to kind of go for a really typical setup with c6, maybe queen c7, eventually e5. Maybe pushing this pawn to a5, and very typical like King's Indian perk style structure. White has a lot of options here. I think knight d2 makes sense. c4 definitely makes a lot of sense. In this game, he chose rook e1, which I think is a very logical move as well. White's trying to prepare e4, but he hasn't committed the knight yet, so the knight can still jump to c3 if necessary. He can also still push c4, basically just keeping all of his options open. Now I definitely had a look at this line before the game, but during the game, because I was just going through so many lines, I simply just didn't remember exactly what I looked at against this move, although I did remember checking it. So I was kind of already on my own here. I decided to, I don't think it's a good idea to try to recall your preparation, because usually you simply convince yourself that you're remembering something when in fact you're not, and that can lead to just making bad moves right out of the opening that you think are good. So I typically in this kind of situation, I try to just forget everything that I think I know and just try to look at the position fresh and try to figure out, what I should be doing here. One of the first moves that comes to mind is definitely the move e5, which I considered. But the main problem with e5 is that after d takes e5, black needs to have a comfortable way to respond here, because taking on e5 here, I think this simply doesn't work because of knight takes e5, which I believe just wins a pawn for white in this position. Knight e5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and bishop takes e5. So despite this, black often plays e5 anyway with the idea to go knight g4 here, and this is a pretty common idea of winning back the e5 pawn. But I wasn't really sure what to think of the position after, let's say, c4. Black recaptures on e5. We'll say knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and knight c3. Okay, I say I wasn't sure, but no, actually I was pretty sure that this position should be better for white. I mean, my experience, the structure I think is really difficult for black to play. The main thing that's happening here to me just feels like the bishop on g2 is just a very strong piece in the position, and white has a lot of pressure against this d5 square. You can plant a knight there. And the problem for black is, in order to play this tempting move c6, you're going to have to weaken your d6 pawn quite a bit, and I don't think black really gets enough compensation in this position, seeing as how white's pawn is on e2, not on e4 like we would see in a lot of King's Indian positions, which gives black a lot of counterplay, but rather on e2, which just gives black a lot fewer targets in the position. So I felt like black would be clearly worse here. I think that's basically true. And so I decided to just play another move and just wait before pushing e5, waiting for white to actually first push e4. Okay, so I believe the move I actually prepped here was the move a5. And this is just a useful waiting move in the position. Sometimes black wants to play a4. In many cases, it's just a matter of controlling the b4 square. And so if my knight ever shows up on c5, it doesn't have to worry about b4. And yeah, if white goes e4, then black goes e5, d takes e5, knight g4. And this is already a much better version compared to the previous position because I got white to play e4, and yeah, I think black has a much more comfortable game here. Alright, so during the game I actually decided to play c6, which I think kind of falls along the similar lines of just making a neutral move and then waiting for e4. But tactically, this move actually does have a pretty significant flaw. So white played e4, I played e5, d takes e5, and knight g4. I felt like this was all pretty much forced. I mean, it was possible to go d takes e5, and then if white tries to grab the pawn with knight takes e5, which I think is critical, black does have this move knight g4 here, which is kind of interesting, putting a ton of pressure on the pin. Kind of a typical tactic, I think, in these types of positions. The engine still gives white some advantage after knight takes c6. It just leads to this pretty forcing and complicated line. I think white ends up a little bit better, but it's not such a big deal. Basically, just means that it's probably not playable for black. Maybe a good try for one game if you're not sure your opponent will be able to figure it out over the board, but objectively not that good. But the move I played, knight g4, objectively is not that good either. I think it's just a little bit harder, let's say, to punish this one. Because it does seem like the d6 pawn is just hanging, and white could play queen takes d6. And I think this was a critical try during the game. I really wasn't sure exactly if I would be getting enough compensation here. My idea was to take on e5. Now white probably has to take on e5. I take with the knight. Now the queen is hanging, as well as the threat of knight f3 check is very annoying, so white probably trades queens, especially given that he's down a pawn, and rook takes d8. And so this was the position me and my opponent actually weren't sure about, because he ended up avoiding this, where, yeah, it wasn't that clear how much compensation black has, but it did feel like black has some annoying pressure. The main problem white's having is, once again, knight f3 check is a pretty serious threat. The knight on b1 cannot be developed so comfortably, because if it goes knight c3 or knight a3, that seems to allow rook d2, which feels like a very annoying move. And black has this idea of bishop g4, and then trying to play either bishop f3 or knight f3 check, just kind of targeting some of white's weaknesses on the king side. So yeah, this is a case where, like, you know, two human players, IMs, we both thought, like, okay, there's definitely some pressure here for black. Stockfish, of course, just kind of, you know, snickers at the idea, and then moves on and says both bishop c3 is apparently much better for white. Black's attack will run out of steam, and white will just be up a pawn soon. And actually, knight c3 is also totally fine for white, apparently. Rook d2 is just not that big of a deal. So yeah, objectively, white could have gone for this, and after one of these two moves, I don't think the game would necessarily be over, but black would definitely have a hard time proving the compensation. But instead, after some thought, my opponent decided to just play knight bd2. And yeah, maybe this was a small missed opportunity on his end, but from white's point of view, it's really not so easy to go for that endgame where you think you're going to be under pressure. And I mean, a lot of players, they would rather just prefer to play with equal material, but play for the initiative rather than grab a pawn and then have to defend, you know, in some kind of uncomfortable spot. But that said, you know, this move does now justify kind of black's entire opening, because now I'm able to recapture on e5 and kind of solve all of my problems, which was nice. I think I actually should have taken with the d knight here. This is just a little bit more active, and the main difference is that taking with this knight rather with the g4 knight is that this knight keeps some pressure on f2, and black has some key ideas with queen b6 in some lines where this tempo is kind of very annoying for white to deal with, especially since, like, rook e2 in some cases will be met with knight takes f2 anyway, rook takes f2, and then second knight comes to g4, and then bishop is hanging, rook on f2 is hanging, and yeah, could be problematic for white. So yeah, I think that was kind of a miss by me. I think I just chose wrong here with knight g takes e5. I think this gives white some healthier options. After knight takes e5, Probably white would have to just trade knights, then black could take with the knight again. And okay, now again we're threatening knight f3 check. We also have ideas of playing like h5, h4, and just getting some play on the king side. And in general, I think this is just a good version of this type of position. I think black's pieces are developed very comfortably. White doesn't really have knight c4. And yeah, I think black is doing well. Okay, so in the game I played knight g takes e5. And now Sean played a pretty interesting move, queen c1. So he's kind of just keeping the tension. He defends his bishop on b2, and he's inviting some trade. So if knight takes f3, knight takes f3, he's certainly willing to trade the dark squared bishops. And I think this makes sense for white, because when we trade the dark squared bishops here, it's definitely my king and my position that ends up with more weaknesses on the dark squares. The d6 pawn, the king side. It's clear that, I mean, white should be seemingly comfortable here. Maybe it's close to equal, but I think white is definitely to be preferred. Instead, I could just play knight to e5, which keeps more pieces on the board, and this comes with the advantage that if white tries to take on e5 a second time, I mean, I could take with the bishop here, and I think black is probably perfectly fine. It would also be possible, I believe, to just take with the pawn and just equalize the structure, and then, I mean, there shouldn't be any reason black has any issues in this position whatsoever. So yeah, objectively, I feel like I should have just done this. This was kind of the easiest way to play the position, and I think, okay, if white wants to keep more play on the board, should probably play like knight d4, avoiding the trade. But then I think this situation is totally fine for black. I would probably just play h5 here, trying to play h4, and yeah, I think black has a perfectly decent counterplay. Okay, instead, I ended up going for this move, bishop h6, which over the board it felt annoying for white to deal with. I mean, this pin on the knight on d2 is not so hard, not so easy to get out of. White just played queen c1, so he's not really going to want to unpin with queen d1. Yeah, so yeah, I felt like kind of an annoying thing to deal with. Now I want to take on f3, bishop takes f3, and then bring my second knight to e5 with tempo, maybe play some f5 somewhere. Yeah, I can feel like I was really, I think, just playing very ambitiously in this game. Maybe I felt like queen c1 was, you know, somewhat of a passive move or something, and I wanted to punish it. Another move I considered was h5, which I think is perfectly reasonable. In fact, b5 also was quite okay for black. Again, most solid would be just trading and playing knight e5, and objectively the position is just about equal. But okay, bishop h6. Now the game, you know, gets very interesting. White plays knight d4, which I think was a really good find. Basically, the idea is now just to gain space with f4 and shut down the bishop on h6, which I completely underestimated, because now it's, if my bishop ends up getting shut out of the game, then I'm going to just have to waste a move going back to g7, which will be a big loss of time. Not to mention the fact that we never ended up trading knights. So now the space advantage that white has is really felt, because I have two knights that are kind of fighting for the same squares, and as a result, it's very hard to develop the bishop on c8. Okay, well, I continue to play actively. I play knight c5. White goes f4. Now, objectively, black should have just played the immediate knight g4 here, and if white goes h3, drop back with knight f6. And I think black has a reasonable position here. I would definitely think white's chances are a little bit better. It's pretty double-edged. White has this nice space advantage with e4, f4, but black does have some real pressure against it, and it's not so easy for white to play this position, because a lot of times when you have, you know, a lot of space to cover, you might overextend a little bit, and your opponent can get instant counterplay. Objectively, I think this was the way to go, and black is only slightly worse. But I felt like, okay, I have to stay consistent. So I tried to look for more aggressive ways to continue my play. And I played the move queen b6, which, I mean, it looks nice, but I think after, you know, just some solid moves from white, black's initiative kind of runs out, and I end up burning a few bridges here. So my main idea, of course, is if white takes on e5, I'll recapture. And now this knight on e5 is hanging. It can't really move in view of knight d3 check, and white would just lose. If white plays a move like knight to c4, which is counterattacking the queen and also opening up against the bishop on h6, I think I can take on c1 here, knight takes b6, take on b2, and the problem is white just has way more pieces hanging than black does. If knight takes a8, we take on d4 with check, then we'll take the rook, and this knight on a8 will be trapped very quickly with knight e6 or knight a6, and white's probably just losing here. Okay, so tactically, the line was working, but of course white is by no means forced to take on e5, and he just plays king h1, which I felt like was the best move, just getting out of the way of these tactics, hitting the knight again on e5, and I definitely considered the move knight to d3 here. I mean, either knight, with the idea of takes, queen moves, let's say, to c2. Now if we take the rook, then white just recaptures, and white will just have 2 pieces for the rook in a fantastic position. But the idea would be to take on b2, and then after queen takes b2, bishop g7, to try to win back the piece with a quick c5 coming. So knight c4 is not in time, because if queen takes d4, knight f3, we go c5 anyway. And yeah, I wasn't sure what to make of these complications. It looked like if I win my piece back, then black should be okay with the super strong dark squared bishop. But I think I found a counter resource that was very unpleasant. I think it was in this position. After takes, white has the move knight c4 here, which I think falls for white under much better circumstances. So now, okay, maybe I don't have to take on c1, but if I do take on c1, knight takes b6, here it's kind of white who's just grabbing more material, as my knight is just not dangerous enough. So yeah, that wasn't working, so black has to come up with something else. I found the move knight to g4. I decided to play this one here. h3 happened, and now I felt like, rather incorrectly, that knight f6 would be leading to a much worse position. I think black is actually still kind of okay here. The main line I underestimated was I thought that white could play knight c4, get this tempo, queen c7, and I mean, I thought this position was okay for black, mainly because I have a lot of pressure against the e4 pawn, but the tactical problem was this move knight takes d6. And here I misevaluated the line. So queen takes d6, white goes e5, and if white is able to just recapture on f6, that'll be, I think, really bad for black. So my only move here is rook takes e5, taking advantage of the pin against white's queen. And yeah, somehow I couldn't make sense of these lines after f takes e5, bishop takes c1, e takes d6, bishop takes b2. I just really wasn't sure, number one, what's going on here. Now it seems like, okay, black can just blockade the pawn and has 2 pieces for the rook, and is probably doing quite okay. Nor could I exactly figure out the line after rook takes e5, queen takes e5, takes, bishop takes c1, and yeah, let's say e takes f6, bishop takes b2, rook d1. Okay, here black is basically going to be up a piece. White has to recapture on c1 instead. And then material is equal, but I gave up the dark squared bishop. I don't know. I really wasn't sure what to make of this position, whether I would be worse or not. The engine seems to think that black is actually quite okay, so objectively this was still worth going for. So that means after knight f6, it's probably not in white's best interest to play knight c4, queen c7. A move like king h2 actually would, I think, at least be more ambitious from white's point of view and kind of fighting for a bigger advantage. But then we can say that black is at least reasonably okay. Like, I'm worse, but I'm not losing yet. I can play bishop d7, and the game goes on. I mean, white still has to tread very carefully because the pressure against the e4 pawn is pretty serious. Okay, so I wasn't sure what to make of that position. I felt like the complications might not be so good for me. So in this position, I tried really hard to make the move knight f2 check work. And I ended up playing this move because I felt like it was kind of worth the risk, given that I didn't like my other options. Okay, so the h3 pawn is hanging, so white kind of has to play king h2. And yeah, here black's play, I have to say, I mean, obviously looks extremely suspicious because the knight on f2 basically has no way back. I mean, I have the bailout with knight d3 at any point, but again, because of this knight c4 idea, I don't think it's going to be working out for black. But I kind of, I made it work because I decided to play the move bishop g7 here. And now this move is putting a lot of pressure along this diagonal, so I have ideas of playing knight e6, for instance. So yeah, for example, after rook e2, I think the response that I had in mind was knight e6, and I felt like black is doing reasonably okay here. Still not totally sure, but well, actually, I'm sorry. I think the point was to play knight d3, because now that the bishop is on g7, this is working as just a tactic. Knight takes d3, and then if allowed, I'm going to take on b2 and take on d4. And now if knight c4, then when I take on c1, my knight will be already hitting white's rook on e2 and then hitting the knight on d4. So here black is just collecting a lot more material. It was kind of weird calculating like the same lines over and over again, and first line black is okay, second line white is winning. Here again black is going up material. So yeah, as you can imagine, we were running lower and lower on time rather quickly. Okay, so yeah, I basically just didn't see a way for white to really take advantage of my knight on f2. I'm putting pressure on h3, and I'm also putting a lot of pressure on e4. And my idea, if allowed, is actually to break with the move d5, where then I'll just be fighting for the e4 square and hopefully getting some initiative based on that. So white goes knight c4. I thought this was quite logical. Queen c7, and now e5. And yeah, I mean, I think this made a lot of sense, and objectively, this is a very strong way to play the position. I took on e5. I wasn't sure if I had much choice. And now knight takes e5. It was also possible even to take with the pawn, but then white is kind of committing to somewhat of a weakened structure. Yeah, it's not so clear still if the knight on f2 can really be targeted. I think in both cases just leads to kind of a double-edged position. Rook takes e5 even was very interesting according to Stockfish, because if black gives up the dark squared bishop, then the queen is going to soon show up on h6, and that could be extremely dangerous with the bishop on b2, of course. But okay, knight takes e5 was played, and now if we take on e5, I don't think these lines really work out for black. I think we end up worse. Let's say takes, rook takes e5, takes, queen takes e5. Now I think white has, a lot of options. I can think about taking on c6 or even going knight f3. I think during the game I was very concerned just about like queen h6 here, with some very serious threats in the position. So yeah, this didn't really feel very playable, and actually ended up finding the only move in the position that keeps black from just losing, because now white is ready to start trying to round up this knight, and that was the move f6, which is a very ugly move to have to play, like totally ruining my kingside and like blocking my bishop. But on the other hand, I felt like I really just have to challenge for the e-file, and this is the only way to do it. If white simply goes back with the knight like knight c4, then I get the e4 square for my knight, and my knight is actually returning to quite a good position. And actually one day if I play f5 and knight e4 and bishop d7, if I can get all these moves in, then black will be completely fine with a nice grip over the e4 square. So it was a pretty ambitious idea, but I also realized that I just didn't see another way to pose problems for white, because again, they're ready to play queen d2, and that's a problem. So yeah, I didn't see anything wrong with f6, and it turns out to be kind of the only move for black not to just fall into a very bad position. Okay, but this also does allow some tactics, because I mean, the rook on e8 is hanging, and of course white is always looking for this kind of potential. There was a few moves that I considered here. Knight takes c6 was definitely a concern of mine, because here if we go, let's say rook takes e1, for example, queen takes e1, b takes e6, then minimum white can just take back on f2, and white has gained a pawn in the process. Maybe queen e8 check is also very strong or worth considering. The After knight c6, my idea was to go bishop takes h3, which I think was a nice counter, defending the rook on e8, and kind of it's like meeting a desperado with another desperado. Here, if white takes on h3, I think black can just take back on h3 again. Now both knights are hanging. If white moves their knight away, then black's knight will also just drop back to f2, and now we have like knight g4, and so my knight is no longer no longer going to be weak, and in fact white's king is now starting to open up a little bit. And if king takes h3, b takes c6, I felt like black should be at least fine in this position because white's king is now a lot weaker. My rooks are connected, you know, I'm not behind in development, and I think black just has a few positional pluses here, and I'm still ready to play f5 very soon. So this I felt like was working for black in the game. My opponent tried another move, knight takes g6. I think this was definitely a better try, but objectively, I think black ends up all right here. I played bishop takes h3 again, bishop takes h3, and now I just recaptured on g6. So the reason I didn't like knight takes h3 here was because, okay, if king takes h3, hg6, then black is totally fine. I'm very happy to play this position, equal material, and yeah, I think black is doing better. But the problem I didn't like is knight h4. So keeping the knight on the board, my knight will have to move, let's say, to f2, and then white gets this really nice f5 square for one of his knights, maybe even the other knight, to open up the bishop. And this I felt quite uncomfortable with, because I just felt like, okay, this knight in this square is now very strong. From white's point of view, white is able to trade off my dark square bishop, and the bishop on b2 just looks like a very dangerous piece to deal with. So for that reason, I decided just to recapture on g6, and now the bishop on h3 is hit. White had an option to play knight e6 here. I think my opponent was analyzing this one for some time. I think he spent a little bit of time calculating here. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I thought the critical line would be to go for this exchange sack with knight e6, bishop takes e6, and then rook takes e6, takes, and queen d7, hitting the rook and then threatening queen h3 check. It turns out black really doesn't have enough after queen e1. So hopefully, I was very excited by this line during the game, but hopefully I would have decided against it. Instead, after knight e6, black has a few moves actually. I think the cleanest way to, let's say, equalize is to play queen d7, just pinning the knight. Very awkward move to play against white's bishop on h3, but the bishop is actually hanging, so we can consider the knight on e6 pinned, and now we're just trying to take on e6, and yeah, white has to figure out how exactly they're gonna, you know, defend this knight. I think something like queen e3 is given by Stockfish, knight e4. And it's like about equal, but about equal is totally fine with me because I felt like a few moves ago I was on the verge of being seriously worse. Okay, instead, after some time, white decided to play bishop f1, which I think was a pretty ambitious move because he's trying to keep the bishop and play for bishop c4 check and get some activity against my king. I played b5. I felt like this was the only move I can I can really afford to make here. a4. Just fighting for the c4 square. And here I decided to play for mate, which I kind of regret with the move bishop f8. It took me a long time to find this move, but that doesn't mean it was necessarily a good move. I feel like I should have just made the simple move a6. I think like 9 out of 10 decent chess players would just play a6 here. After a takes b5, c takes b5, we keep the c4 square under control. We have the e4 square for our knights, and it's kind of the concept I was playing for earlier, like let's say bishop g2, knight c e4. I think black is extremely comfortable here, maybe even better. I mean, the two knights are supporting each other. They look weird, but they do control a lot of squares, and they are now kind of well protected. So not easy for white to play around these knights. There's no queen e3 because of knight g4 check. So it's just not easy for white to play this position. And black's idea is now playing like king f7, rook h8, knight g4, knight h3, g3 pawn might be hanging. Yeah, I think black is really comfortable here. So it's kind of a shame I just talked myself out of playing the most natural move, but yeah, I mean, sharp positions, a lot of mistakes are going to happen. So what can you do? Okay, so bishop f8. Now my idea is to go for some attack with queen h7 check, knight e4, and then trying to give checkmate. White played king g2, a good prophylactic move. I decided to trade rooks, queen takes e1, and knight ce4 coming in. Bishop d3. So now he's opening up his queen so that he can defend with queen g1 if he needs to. I played rook e8. And yeah, now white just takes on b5. So this is the problem of my move, bishop f8 from earlier, is that I'm kind of committed to this attack where I'm burning a lot of bridges. Now white is winning at least a pawn on b5. And black has a lot to prove now because I'm going down a pawn. The position is opening up. White's light square bishop is going to be a really strong piece. And so if black's attack doesn't pan out, then it could be really bad. And yeah, I mean, after queen h7, I think I just don't get enough. One idea that white has now is to play bishop c4 check, king h8, and queen h1 here I think is totally possible, which is a nice sacrifice. Basically giving up an exchange. But leaving us in this position, which actually I wasn't sure how to evaluate. Maybe I'm actually mixing things up because this position feels like black should be at least okay here. I think we're not really losing a lot of material. So yeah, I think I was worried about some other iteration of this line. But basically I'm really not getting enough play here. Maybe this is worth going for. I think I should just check the line a little bit deeper, but the engine already thinks that white's position is really good, so I'm sure white has some kind of resource there to defend against black's attack. So after ab5, I decided to play c takes b5. I didn't see a better choice. White played bishop takes b5, and here I actually missed my chance, which I definitely looked for during the game, but simply couldn't make it work. Because again, here I wanted to try queen h7, where now, yeah, bishop c4 check, queen h1, definitely not leading to a good position for white. But the problem is after bishop takes rook, I didn't actually see the mate here. Queen h3 check, king f3, and I can play queen takes g3 check. If I go queen h5 check, then I think the king just runs to e3, and it seems like black is going to run out of ideas. So queen takes g3, this seemed like the critical move, king e2, and yeah, the only move I could find here in my calculation was the move queen g4 check, in which after knight f3, it just seemed like black's ideas were running out. Like I didn't see another good check for me here. I didn't really see a way to make any kind of real threat, and white is already up a rook, and I mean that's just a huge amount of material. So if there's no follow-up, then the game is just over. But it turns out that in this position, black had the move queen takes f4. Just a very, very quiet move, grabbing the pawn. But the big idea behind this move is that all of a sudden it frees the knight on e4 to finally give this check on g3. In every other line we've seen so far, knight g3 check is not possible because the king is able to take on f2. The queen on f4 simply defending the knight. Now knight g3 check is actually a huge threat because white's king all of a sudden is caught in a mating net. Like knight is defending these squares, queen is covering this diagonal as well as the e3 square, and yeah, this is basically currently it's a mate threat. But okay, white has a move to get out, and it turns out that white just doesn't have a defense. Black is winning. Can play queen g1, then check, king e1, queen e3, and we're giving mate next move. So yeah, it was a bit of a shame I missed this one because, well, over the board, you know, I don't remember exactly how much time I had, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, but I definitely spent several minutes just looking at queen h7 and trying to make it work, both in this position and like in the previous position when I was kind of calculating c takes b5, bishop takes b5, I was trying to make it work. But yeah, I mean, I simply just didn't consider this move, queen takes f4, seriously enough. I mean, I think I realized it was possible, but when you're down a rook, you instinctively reject most quiet moves because you assume that, okay, quiet move is not going to be that dangerous. The opponent should have some kind of defense, right? They have a whole tempo, but yeah, sometimes these resources, you know, show up in random places, and it's important to look for them because if you find it, then yeah, had I found this idea, I think then it's likely, I could have won the game. After queen h7, I should mention white doesn't have to take the rook. In fact, had I put queen h7 on the board, my opponent would have probably spent a lot of time thinking and would have likely found the queen takes f4 idea himself. White can go, I think, queen g1, and objectively it's still extremely unclear, but black's attack is certainly strong. For example, like queen h3 check, king f3, queen f3 check, and then white has to go king e3 because king g2 runs into queen takes g3 with check and knight d2. So, I mean, this just looks incredibly dangerous from white's point of view. And objectively, I think Stockfish just gives, like, a draw. 0-0-0. But the amazing thing in this position is not just that, the main line leads to a draw. Like, that often happens. Okay, we have nothing better than a perpetual check, and so that's that. But the funny thing about this position is that there are like 3 or 4 moves for black that all lead to a draw, and not in the same way, not via the same perpetual. So like bishop b4 is a move, apparently rook e5 is a move, utilizing that f takes e5 is met with bishop h6 mate. So yeah, it's always funny when you see like multiple moves that all just lead to dead equality. Okay, both sides would still have to find that, of course. But yeah, in the game, I couldn't make it work, and I thought I'd be down a rook, so I couldn't go for it. I ended up playing the move rook e7, just kind of just like a lame duck. And now white definitely gets the initiative because I have suddenly blocked my queen from the h-file. I mean, the rook didn't really have a better square in view of knight e6 coming. And yeah, now white kind of takes over. He goes bishop c4 check, king h8. And here he played queen a5, which I think was not the best move, but certainly it put a lot of problems to black. I think the engine gives knight f3, among other moves, and just says that white has a decisive advantage here. And yeah, it's not that hard to see now. I mean, both bishops are extremely strong against my king, and if my knights on f2 and e4 are not actually going to be creating any threats, then we can consider them pretty bad pieces because they're just getting in each other's way. They're not really doing anything, especially the knight on f2. If it doesn't contribute to anything, then it's going to be like I'm just down a piece in the position. But okay, queen a5 I think was also a good try. I played queen d7. I felt like I have to keep the queens on the board. Now I'm threatening queen h3 check, so f5 only move, blocking this off. And here I decided to play queen d6. At this point we were in pretty heavy time trouble. I think we only had 5 minutes left for the rest of the game, along with the 30-second increment. So my idea here wasn't too sophisticated, just targeting the pawn. Apparently black would still be fine after the move knight g4, threatening knight e3 check. If rook h1 check, we have rook h7, and everything is just kind of okay. And white's queen on a5 actually maybe not the best placed piece right now. But yeah, at this point, I mean, the position is so messy, it's not too surprising that, we made a lot of mistakes in this phase of the game. So queen d6, knight e2. Yeah, now again, I didn't like knight g4 in view of rook h1 check, although that really wasn't worth fearing, at least not that much. I decided to play knight d1, which looked like a much trickier move and much harder move to deal with in time trouble, especially. Blocking the rook, the same idea to play knight e3 check. I'm also hitting the bishop, but objectively it's total garbage. It's I mean, I think I already realized that like my position is kind of in ruins, and so I really just have to try to mix it up and hope for a mistake, because otherwise white is ready to just start consolidating. Knight is coming to f4 maybe, and white is just gonna completely open up my position. Okay, so this is my try. Bishop a3 here turned out to be good for white. Like knight e3 check might be a little bit scary, but king g1, and it turns out black just doesn't have much. My opponent actually played a stronger move, objectively bishop d4, which covers the e3 square and all of a sudden kills the knight on d1. I thought for a little bit here, I realized my only try is the move knight takes g3, which I was kind of counting on. And yeah, okay, now the position looks super sharp. If white goes knight takes g3, then I think I can simply just take on d4, and black is doing all right. Yeah, super messy. Didn't feel like white has such a such an easy way to proceed here. I mean, white could easily go wrong and blunder something. This may be a good exercise for you guys to pause the video and try to figure out the best move in this position for white. And okay, so it turns out the best move is f takes g6, which is I think not a very easy move to find. During the game, I slightly considered this move because I realized if white takes on g6, well, there's no threat yet because my knight is covering the h5 square. But if I do take on e2, then queen h5 check is going to just be leading to instant mate. But because there was no threat on h5 yet, I think maybe this is the reason my opponent also rejected the move. It didn't feel like this move was that strong because it doesn't come with a threat. Queen h5 check is not a threat, right? But the problem is that now it kind of freezes black's knight on g3, and this is a very difficult concern for black. I think I was analyzing here, like rook takes e2, for example. White can go bishop takes e2, queen takes d4, and I think white can simply just take the knight on d1 with the rook, if I'm not mistaken. And black is just going to run out of ideas soon. I'm down in exchange. Bishop f3 is coming, and my king is going to be super weak. As soon as this queen gets to the 7th rank, it's just going to be over. White also has now ideas. Yeah, rook h1 check and queen h5 if knight takes h1. So this is actually just completely winning for white. If knight e3 check, this is another try. Then white can take on e3, rook takes e3, and just go queen takes a7, hitting the rook, and also again hitting this mate on h7. So basically, once this pawn gets to g6, it's just extremely difficult for black to deal with it. Okay, so after knight takes g3, my opponent ended up playing queen a6, which doesn't yet blow the win, but it does make it a lot harder for white. I played knight e3 check. This was kind of I think my only real try in the position. Yeah, this was white's last chance. Had he played the move king f3, then I think white is still has really good winning chances. The main idea now is, okay, everything is hanging in black's position, so I have no choice but to allow some simplifications. Knight takes c4, white can take on d6, knight takes d6, and then bishop takes f6 check, key resource for white, winning a lot of material. After bishop g7, can take on e7, and white is just winning more stuff in the long run. Bishop a1 takes, knight f5 takes, king f4. This was kind of the key line that Stockfish was indicating, and it turns out white will win this pawn, and I believe the endgame is just lost for black. I mean, it's something like plus 10, so we can trust that evaluation. But basically it looks like the king is just close enough, and with the same color bishops, black is just not going to be able to defend here. Okay, so this line was definitely not easy to see. I mean, especially with like 3 minutes on your clock, you know, playing a move like king f3 is extremely scary. You know, you never know what's going to happen here. But it is a concrete decision, and the main advantage that white has going for them is that these bishops are just so strong. Now bishop takes f6, such a huge threat that yeah, if black doesn't have any good checks, then you know white is just going to be winning. But okay, I was a little bit fortunate here. My opponent decided to go for bishop takes e3, which I think is the most natural move. It's the move most of us would play, especially in time trouble. You know, when you're dealing with knight e3 check, it just makes sense just to take the knight and avoid getting into trouble. But now I'm able to play rook takes e3. My queen on d6 is newly defended. Queen takes d6, bishop takes d6, and the knight on g3 also ends up defended. So I kind of like how everything kind of all of a sudden coordinated for black, and all the pieces are protecting each other, and I have just enough counterplay in this position to avoid losing, even though my a7 pawn, g6 pawn are both hanging. Knight on e2 is currently under attack. After knight takes g3, I get a key tempo with rook takes g3, king f2 is played, and here it's basically just very much a drawish endgame. I played g takes f5. I think this was kind of the easiest way. The point being, after rook takes a7. So here, I mean, there are definitely ways for black to go wrong here. For example, the immediate bishop c5 check, forcing a rook trade. Normally this is a good thing to do in endgames with bishops of opposite color. If you're the defending side, you want to get to just a pure endgame bishop versus bishop. But here, I mean, white is left with two connected passers, and objectively this position is actually lost for black. I mean, not all positions with two connected pass pawns are lost for the defending side. In fact, most of them are drawn, but you need to be able to get a specific setup with the king and bishop always ready to sacrifice, and in this case, black is just not in time to do it. White's king is just too active, and black won't be able to get that defensive setup. So that would actually be losing for black, and I think my opponent was really hoping for that, because he probably realized that this endgame could have some potential for him. But yeah, I managed to avoid falling into that. I found actually just a much cleaner way to equalize, and that was with the move rook takes b3. So I grab one pawn with Desperado rook before giving bishop c5 check. It's very important here that white doesn't have tempo move rook a8 check, because black can go rook b8. If I had to move my king, then white can just take the rook, and he would be avoiding bishop c5 check, and black would just be losing. But here, black is totally holding. In the game, white just took on b3, bishop c5, king f3, and we agreed to a draw, because the remaining endgame is just going to be dead drawn. So yeah, I felt like I definitely got away with one there. I mean, even just 5 moves ago, we could say black was completely lost. At this point, king f3 would have posed some really serious problems, as well as earlier f takes g6 and other options white had along the way. I mean, during the game, of course, it felt like white should have something, but neither of us, really saw what white could do to clearly win. So it's always one of those things where the engine kind of makes it look obvious after the game, but during the game both players are really confused and have a lot of trouble figuring out exactly what's going on. So a messy game, but I felt happy that I ended up saving it, because I felt like I was certainly on the verge there of losing for quite a bit. Okay, so this put me at 2.5 out of 6 for the tournament with 3 rounds to go. I'll be covering them in the next video, so I'll see you guys then. Take care.